Hi, my name is Joey Lovestrand, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at SOAS University of London. And today I'll be talking about ideophones, expressiveness, and system integration in Barayin. Let me say thank you first to the organizers and everyone who's been participating in this workshop for making it a great and interesting experience. I'll tell you a bit about the background of the language that we're talking about today, Barayin. Before talking more specifically about the corpus that's used for the study of ideophones and other words that have expressiveness. And then when I get into really the content of the analysis of the data, I'll be talking about ideophones and their expressiveness. And then I'll talk about another class of words that also features expressiveness in the language that are not ideophones that I'm calling here expressive quantifiers that might also be called quasi-ideophones. And then at the end, I'll just say a few words about gestures. So what about this language, Barayin? It's an Afroasiatic language of the Chadic family that you see here in black on that map of Afroasiatic languages, and specifically it's of the East Chadic family there. The East Chadic languages are all spoken in the Republic of Chad, a country with about 130 languages. And more specifically, Barayin is spoken in the Gyora region, which is a region with about 25 indigenous languages. And besides the related Chadic languages that you see here in pink, Barayin is also in contact with Niger-Congo languages of the Adamawan group, the Central Sudanic languages, in particular Bagirmi, and the language of water communication in the area is Chaldean Arabic, of course, a Semitic language. There's estimated to be around 6,000 people who are part of the Barayin group, but this group is divided into 4 self-identified subgroups, of which only 2, the 2 largest, Chalkia and Gilia, speak mutually intelligible dialects. And these are the only 2 that have been studied as well. And so when I refer to Barayin here, I'm really referring to these 2 dialects. This research has mostly been in 2 phases. There's a period from 2010 to 2012, when I was working with the Barayin first to launch a literacy program in the language, which turned into an MA thesis, and then a period of 2014 to 2018, when I was working on a PhD and returned to Chad to do research with the Barayin. And these were the 2 primary consultants for those periods, Musa Adu and Nasru Alias. Sadly, Nasru passed away a couple of years ago. Now, for the data that's used for this particular analysis, it's primarily from a 2017 Endangered Languages Documentation Program small grant for language documentation, which allowed us to spend a few months recording people speaking the language in different contexts. So we have about 17 hours of recorded speech. Of that, there are 64 texts that have been transcribed and translated, and 47 of those texts have been given a morpheme by morpheme glossing, which is essential for this kind of work. The corpus that I'm using for this particular analysis is a little bit smaller, it's 32 text and right about 19,000 words. This data was put together with the help of a team of people from the Barayin group. There on the left, you see Mahmoud Pasha doing some filming. Muhammad Isibuna was also helping filming, although you don't see him in that picture. He's filming Usman Amin there in white, who was the president of the Language Association and coordinated a lot of this work. And on the right there, you see Sumayin Ahmad Dagash, who was the main person doing the transcription and translation of these texts, so absolutely essential to this analysis. The transcription and translation was done in time-aligned annotations, either in Seymour or in Elan, and then imported into Flex, where the morpheme by morpheme glossing was done. And this allows me to look into a Flex concordance and to see where words are distributed across the corpus, but then link it back to particularly where in a video that transcription is from, so that I can see exactly what's happening with the prosody, with the gestures, and everything else in the video. And all of this information is documented with the Endangered Languages Archive, or ELAR. Okay, so now to the analysis of ideophones and expressiveness in Barayin. I'm assuming I'll approach ideophones something like Digamansi's approach and his definitions of ideophones as a lexical class of marked words that depict sensory imagery. This seems to capture pretty well a fairly large class of words in Barayin. Barayin ideophones include many marked phones, which in the case of Barayin includes the palatal stop or affricate ch, the labial and the labial dental fricative v, and in a few cases, actually, there's a labial dental flap as well. These sounds otherwise only occur in loan words, and the same thing with marked phonotactics. Words in Barayin don't end in stops. with the exception of loanwords and this other class of ideophones that have this marked phonological feature. So here's an example of an idiophone with some of these marked features. It starts with the palatal stop and ends with an alveolar stop, both of which are not typical features of Barayin phonology. And these ideophones are also subject to all kinds of expressiveness, although there's a few relevant patterns we'll talk about here. One that's very common is reduplication. And usually this is full reduplication, which could also be called repetition. I'm not making any distinction there. There are 2 cases or 3 cases of partial reduplication as well, but normally this is repetition of a complete word. So here's an example of reduplication of this idiophone, which in this case is depicting the sound of an animal moving. And here's an example of partial reduplication, which is the second syllable ra that gets repeated multiple times in this example. In addition, there's a subtype of reduplication where you have a striking rising pitch, so that each time a word is repeated, it's repeated at a higher and higher pitch. And since the pitch continues to get higher, it goes way beyond the tonal register. So Barayin is a tonal language and tone is used for lexical contrast. But in this case, the pitch goes well beyond the normal high tone for that speaker. So here's an example of an idiophone being repeated, but getting higher in pitch in each instance. Now, in addition to the reduplication, we also get extreme lengthening of a vowel or sonorant. There are, again, phonemic contrasts for long vowels and long consonants in Barayin, but in this case, the lengthening is far beyond what would a normal long vowel or long consonant would be. So here's an example of the last syllable of a idiophone being lengthened. And here's an example of a sonorant, in this case, the alveolar trill being lengthened. You'll actually hear this word being pronounced twice. And in the first case, the R sound is really lengthened a lot. In the second case, it's not really lengthened very significantly. And then there's also cases where you don't get reduplication or extreme lengthening, but you do still get some kind of increased intensity there with the idiophone. And so I've marked these as well as a case of expressiveness. Although other words besides ideophones, of course, can also receive increased intensity. I thought it was worth noting cases where there's a marked increased intensity. So here's an example of idiophone here, the last word in the sentence, being pronounced with a higher intensity than the rest of the sentence. If we look at the distribution of expressiveness across ideophones in the corpus, we have 105 tokens of ideophones in this corpus, and just over half of those have some type of expressiveness, and half don't seem to have any significant kinds of expressiveness. A lot of that's reduplication, so about a quarter of all the ideophones, about half of those that have some kind of expressiveness show reduplication or repetition. And in a minority of those cases, there's also this rising pitch that can be observed. Lengthening among ideophones is not quite as common, but it's still there pretty consistently. And then there's also a small percentage where you just get an increase in intensity. Now, what I wanted to relate to in this talk is work that's been done before by Digamansi and Akita, looking at the distribution of this expressiveness and the morphosyntactic system, what they called system integration. The basic idea here being that if a word is somehow more integrated or more core to what's happening in the syntax, then it's less available for expressiveness. So they describe this as an inverse relation that holds across varied languages, such that more expressiveness goes together with less grammatical integration and vice versa. And so Digamansi applies this to Cebu ideophones, another African language, and he groups all the ideophones into 5 syntactic functions. Three of those functions are said to be less grammatically integrated, less integrated into the system. Those are the free functions, the adverbial, complement, and holophrase function. Holophrase being when the word is pronounced as its own prosodic unit. And then there's the bound functions, the adjectival and predicative function that are said to feature less expressiveness because they're more integrated into the grammar. So here's the numbers that Digamasi gets when he groups his 219 ideophones from the corpus he was looking at into these different functions, adverbial being the primary function, complement being the second most common function, then holophrase and others being less common. And so these three most common functions are said to be the free functions where you'll see more expressiveness, and the other functions you'll see less expressiveness. So I did something similar with Barayin ideophones, looking at them and trying to class them by syntactic function. Similarly to Siwu, we see adverbial function is the most common function. However, there's a difference here in that predicate functions for ideophones seems to be more common in Barayin, and the complement function, the complement of a verb, seems to be less common. And then what I wanted to look at is for each of these syntactic functions, how frequently are they found with expressiveness. And so we found expressiveness pretty widespread across all of these functions with two obvious exceptions, and that's the complement function and the adjectival, what I'm hearing here, the adjectival function, where an idiophone modifies an adjective or co-occurs with an adjective. In these two functions, even though there's not a lot of examples, we don't see any expressiveness in those examples. So here's a case of a verbal complement. It's the verb gana, which is to do or to make, and idiophone kusklin. You'll hear it 2 or 3 times in these few sentences, and each time there's no expressiveness. And here's an example of an idiophone modifying an adjective. I'm analyzing this idiophone as one word, not as a case of duplication. That's because in the few instances where it always occurs in this form with 2 syllables. And so I'm just assuming that this is a 2-syllable idiophone. And that fits the pattern that's seen elsewhere. And so here you'll hear it modifying an adjective and without any other expressiveness. So we could make a hypothesis about Barayin to say that there are particular syntactic functions, such as being a complement of a verb or modifier of an adjective, that are more integrated into the system and therefore less available for expressiveness. So we don't expect to find expressiveness or don't expect to find as much expressiveness in these particular syntactic contexts. It's interesting to contrast this with the Siwu analysis, where verbal complements was considered a free part of the system that was more available to expressiveness, because here in Barayin, it seems that the verbal complements are not available to expressiveness. That's not necessarily a problem because we're not assuming that all of these categories are universal or that languages must necessarily treat system integration in exactly the same way across different languages. So the general idea I think still works, but it's interesting to note that contrast. A major drawback here is that the data for these cases that appear to be limited in the availability of expressiveness is really limited. So with complements of verbs, for example, there's only 6 tokens, only 2 types of ideophones, and it's the same speaker both times who uses these ideophones as verbal complements. So more research could be used there to really figure out if that's going to be a consistent pattern across more data. There's another hypothesis we could put in relationship to this idea of system integration and expressiveness, but again, it's very limited data. But the idea is that negated ideophones don't seem to feature expressiveness. That holds for 3 examples, but again, 3 examples are very limited. One of those actually happens to be a complement anyway, so that we really don't expect to find expressiveness there. So that's something that would need to be further tested. So here's an example of the idiophone that's one of the idiophones that's used as a predicate under negation, and you'll hear it pronounced twice, and the second time it's followed by the negation marker do, and there's no expressiveness. I had previously, and if you saw my abstract, you'll see me talk about the position of the word in relationship to the edge of a clause. And my previous hypothesis going through this data had been that if a word is at the boundary of a clause or next to the boundary of a clause, only followed by one of a small class of clause final particles, then that's a position that was available for expressiveness. But if a idiophone was more central to the clause or elsewhere in the clause, it wouldn't have any expressiveness. As it turns out, I only had to dig a little bit further into my data to find that there are examples of idiophones further away from the boundary of a clause with expressiveness. And so I found two examples of idiophones that are in a more medial position that do have expressiveness, which means that this hypothesis that expressiveness relates to your closeness to a clause boundary doesn't seem to hold up with the data as it's been analyzed so far. And so there's another class of words that also features expressiveness heavily across the corpus that are not idiophones. And the four specific words I'm talking about are this word tak, which means thoroughly or completely, chop, which means a little bit, ke, which is like a durative marker, something like on, and then pajiga, which is the universal quantifier. So everyone, everything, all of them, those kinds of meanings. And like idiophones, these expressive quantifiers are phonologically marked and they feature expressiveness. I've talked about these a bit before and mentioned that they are different than idiophones in that these words are used across multiple languages in the area where idiophones are not borrowed across different languages. So tak and ke are also used in Chedi and Arabic, among other local languages, and chop also used by neighboring languages. And I've claimed that these words don't depict sensory imagery, that they have different semantics, they have quantifier semantics. And beyond just the intuition behind that, I've also tried to show how, if you look at their distribution across the corpus, you can also see an effect of these different semantics. And there's two things to consider. One is that idiophones each occur as a type of idiophone, they each occur very infrequently across the corpus. So if you look at quantifiers, by contrast, they're fairly common. The quantifier K, the durative marker, occurs 57 times in the corpus we're working with now. Tak occurs 18 times, chop occurs 17 times, but the most frequent idiophone across this corpus of 19,000 words only shows up 4 times. So there's a strong difference in their distribution in that sense. And I take that to be evidence that idiophones have very specific semantics that are used in particular contexts or in particular collocational constructions. And so they're less frequent across the corpus because of the specificity, where quantifiers have more general meaning, more general function, and can fit into more contexts, and so therefore appear more frequently across the corpus. And then you can also divide up the corpus into different genres, and in particular, I'm focused on this self-identified genre of sidiki. It's an emic genre of folktales in the language, and about 20% of this particular corpus is made up of sidiki or folktales, and the rest is non-folktales. And if we look at the distribution of idiophones across folktales versus other recordings, we find that the percentage of idiophones and folktales is much higher in folktales than it is in non-folktales. So in the portion of the corpus as folktales, you find that idiophones are over 1%, about 1.5% of the words in that portion of the corpus, where in the rest of the corpus, idiophones are much less frequent. But expressive quantifiers don't show this kind of effect. They're fairly similar in distribution across folktales and non-folktales, and in fact, slightly more frequently occurring in non-folktales. Expressive quantifiers is a label that I'm using here, which is essentially equivalent to quasi-idiophones as used by Akita, and it's really Akita's work that sort of pushed me to look at this in the first place. So I wanted to mention something about why I've gone away from using this label, even though I use it in the abstract. But it's essentially the same definition, prosaic adverbs for degree of frequency with typical idiophonic morphology. One reason I wanted to go away from quasi-idiophones is because when you have this kind of framing of these words in terms of how they are almost like but not quite idiophones, you get this idea that there's somehow a deficient class of words or a particularly exceptional class of words. And you find quotes like comparing real idiophones with quasi-idiophones as if these were somehow universal concepts and that we could test whether something really qualified as idiophone or not. And so I find that just to be a bit of an unhelpful framing. But another reason for not using quasi-idiophones is because not all of the words I'm describing are adverbs. In particular, the word pajiga, this universal quantifier, is very clearly a noun. It takes an obligatory possessive suffix. It's weird for a noun that this suffix is obligatory, but this suffix only occurs with noun, and the suffix becomes inflected to agree with the referent of the quantifier. So pajiga is the third person plural suffix for all of them. If you said paji, that's the third person singular masculine suffix, so all of it. Or you can also say pajiana, which is the first person plural inclusive suffix for all of us. And I'm trying to get at a more general point that we can disassociate or not conflate expressiveness and idiophones. So languages may have a particular boundary around which words can feature expressiveness in the language, and idiophones might be the majority of that space. So the majority of words that feature expressiveness might be idiophones, but there could be words from other lexical classes like adverbs and nouns that could also feature expressiveness. And so idiophones is not exactly the same as expressiveness, but it's one feature of idiophones that they can be expressive, and that this expressiveness is available for other word classes as well. It just happens to be, in this case, I'm talking about quantifiers, hence the label expressive quantifiers. So looking across the corpus of 19,000 words, where we have 105 idiophones, we also have 138 tokens of expressive quantifiers. And we can do a comparison of syntactic functions of these quantifiers with the idiophones. So here you see the quantifiers in green and the idiophones in blue. And what first stands out is that they're both primarily adverbial in their function. So we see a lot of instances of these quantifiers being used as adverbials, just like idiophones. But there's some clear differences that stand out as well. One, this verbal complement and adjectival function is only found with idiophones. The quantifiers are not found in this function. Two is that then there's a couple of functions where we find quantifiers that we don't find idiophones. So one is as a conjunction, and the other is as an argument. Here's an example of a expressive quantifier being used as a conjunction. In this case, it's the word chop being used to mean a bit later or a short time later. And here's another example, and this time it's the expressive quantifier K, the derivative marker, being used as in a conjunction. And so you'll get the sentence, I relax, and then he'll say K na. So this is the conjunction, the quantifier being used as a conjunction to say sometime later, that there was a period of time that passed and then something else happened. And you notice in this instance, even though it's being used as a conjunction, you still get this expressiveness, you still get this lengthening. Here's the quantifier pudging. In this case, it's inflected for second person plural, say all of you. And it's followed by ni, which is the second person plural subject marker as well. So you have both the quantifier and the subject pronoun referring to the same referent. You can also get this quantifier as an argument, in this case as a subject, without any other pronoun referencing the same argument. So in this case, it's pajiga and it's the subject, and there's no other pronoun or any other argument in this clause. So returning to the syntactic distribution of expressive quantifiers, it's useful to get more specific about which of these quantifiers appear in which syntactic functions. So here I've separated them out by color. K, tak, and chop are the adverbial ones you see there in red, green, and yellow. And in blue, you see pajiga, which is the one that's nominal. And so it clearly has a very different distribution. The nominal quantifier is the only one that has a predicative function among the expressive quantifiers, and it's the only one that's used as an argument or an adnominal that is a modifier of other nouns. Now to look at the distribution of expressiveness across expressive quantifiers compared with idiophones. So on the left side there, you'll see that the idiophone distribution that we've seen before, where about half of idiophones have expressiveness. And on the other side, you'll see expressiveness of these expressive quantifiers. Now you can see that expressiveness is even more frequent. It's actually about 70% of the expressive quantifiers that are featured expressiveness across the corpus. And the particular difference is the frequency of lengthening. Lengthening is much more common with these expressive quantifiers than it is with idiophones. To look more specifically at each of these expressive quantifiers one by one across the corpus, the two that feature lengthening feature very frequently. So this is K, which about half the time has some kind of expressive lengthening. But in addition to that, K can also be reduplicated. And this is the only word in the corpus that is found reduplicated in some cases and lengthened in other cases. All of the other words that I've seen in the corpus with expressive marking, you only either find that word with reduplication or you find that word with lengthening. But I haven't seen examples of both. Now, the caveat there, of course, is that with the idiophones, there's only a few examples of each idiophone across the corpus. So I don't know if that would hold up in a larger corpus. But K does stand out as being both reduplicated and lengthened and very frequently found with expressive marking. Pajiga, on the other hand, is frequently lengthened, but there's never reduplication of Pajiga. Here's a case of lengthening of K that I wanted to throw in because this is the most extreme example of expressive lengthening. In this case, the vowel is 1.6 seconds. Now, looking at chop and tak, these two expressive quantifiers never have lengthening. They just have reduplication. Tak is the one that has reduplication much more than chop. And it's very rarely found without expressive marking. At least it will have intensity, but it frequently has reduplication and also frequently has reduplication with a rising pitch. Here's an example of tak being reduplicated. In this case, there's 6 repetitions of tak. Now, this kind of reduplication of quantifiers is not only found with these general quantifiers, chop and tak. It's actually something that's also found with cardinal numbers. And so this is something that I didn't really take into account when I was first going through the analysis of this data, but I thought it was worth mentioning here because this probably has a role to play in trying to better understand how reduplication is used. So with cardinal numbers, reduplication can also have a distributive interpretation. So in this case, it's number 1, and it's repeated several times to mean 1 each. So that's probably something that needs to be taken into account in a fuller analysis of how reduplication is used with quantifiers. So that's the distribution of expressiveness across each of these functions. So this is looking at, again, all of the 4 quantifiers conflated into their syntactic functions and looking at how common expressiveness is in each of these functions. And the one thing that stands out here is that it's the predicate function where we don't see any cases of expressiveness. And so again, this is only the universal quantifier pajiga that occurs as a predicate among the quantifiers. It occurs 6 times, and in those 6 times, there's no expressiveness. Looking at just the syntactic functions of pajiga, the universal, all of them or all of it, when it occurs as an argument or when it occurs as a nominal, that's where we see frequent expressiveness. It's only when it occurs as a predicate that we're not seeing examples of expressiveness so far in the corpus. Looking now at just the quantifier tak completely or thoroughly, it seems to primarily function as an adverb, and it's in that adverbial function where it gets a heavy amount of expressiveness. Chop is similar in that it has this adverbial function, and it's that adverbial function where we see a lot of expressiveness. When chop occurs as a conjunction, however, in the 4 cases where you can see it in a conjunction function, it doesn't have any expressiveness in that function. This contrasts with K, the derivative marker, which, like the others, occurs as an adverb, has lots of expressiveness as an adverb. But when it's used as a conjunction, it can frequently have expressiveness. So that's unlike chop. They're similar in that both can be conjunctions, but they're different in how frequent expressiveness is used in that function. And so as a general generalization, we can see that expressiveness is very common, in particular in the adverbial function, the hollow phrase function, and this is a lot like ideophones. But looking more specifically at the different syntactic functions, the predicate function is only used by the universal quantifier pajiga, and in those cases, it doesn't have expressiveness. Now, this contrasts with ideophones, which occur as predicates and frequently have expressiveness even when they're occurring as predicates. And then in the function of a conjunction, we see that there's two of these quantifiers that can have that function, but chop in that function does not show expressiveness, and k in that function does show expressiveness. So in summary, ideophones have several syntactic functions, but the most common ones are this adverbial function or a predicate function, and that expressiveness is fairly consistently across different functions, showing up around half or more of the tokens. But it's not the only areas where they don't show up, at least so far, are verbal complements and adjectivals. Now, comparing that with expressive quantifiers, three of the expressive quantifiers are primarily adverbial and in that sense function a lot like ideophones. One of them is primarily nominal. Expressiveness is even more frequent with the expressive quantifiers than it is with ideophones. So we find expressiveness in about 70% of the tokens overall. And this is especially frequent in the adverbial function. And then there's some differences as well. So the three adverbial quantifiers don't show up as predicates, but the nominal quantifier does, but without expressiveness. Then there's also this unique function of being used as a conjunction for chop and ke. So what does that tell us now about our trying to compare where expressiveness occurs with the syntax or how integrated a word is into the system? So returning to the idea from Digmansi and Nikita, we could say, well, we can have this hypothesis that when ideophones occur as a verbal complement or an adjectival, they're syntactically integrated and less available to expressiveness. Which is a bit different than Siru, as was mentioned. That's not necessarily problematic. What does seem problematic for this approach is the syntactic function of predicate and the syntactic function of conjunction. So if we're just thinking about predicate as a syntactic function and whether or not it's integrated into the system and then more or less available for expressiveness, if we're looking at the quantifier pajiga, we'd be tempted to say, well, in this case, it looks like the predicate is integrated into the system because this word pajiga occurs as a predicate without expressiveness in this context, but it occurs with expressiveness in other contexts. However, that doesn't work as a generalization for the language because ideophones occur as predicates with expressiveness. And so in this case, just whether or not a word that's available for expressiveness is occurring as a predicate, that does not predict whether expressiveness is likely to occur with that word. Because pajiga behaves differently than the ideophones. So there has to be something else taken into account. And it's a similar case with the conjunctions. When chop and ke are used as conjunctions, one does not appear to be expressive, the other does. And so again, we can't simply appeal to the syntactic function as an explanation for whether expressiveness is occurring or not in these cases. There has to be some other explanation, whether that's simply saying different lexical classes behave differently, or getting deeper into the semantics and saying that words with different semantics can feature different kinds of expressiveness, and maybe different kinds of expressiveness are available for different syntactic functions and not available elsewhere. So there needs to be some further explanation beyond simply the syntactic function to explain the distribution of expressiveness, particularly in how expressiveness is used with these quantifiers. So that's the main point, or at least what I've gotten from the data so far, the position that I'm at. But before I end, I just want to say a few words about gestures. So it's sort of assumed that, or been shown really through previous research, that expressive ideophones are more likely to occur with iconic gestures. So here's some examples of gestures being used with ideophones. In this case, it's the ideophone paj, and you'll see a slight hand movement, but it's a fairly clear whipping gesture made to show the whipping sound of this paj ideophone. And in this case, the ideophone is the first word in the sentence, and you'll hear that it's accompanied by an audible clap. It's not always the case that ideophones have gestures co-occurring with them. And so we saw this example before, but I'm showing it again just to point out that the gesture that's the speaker makes here ends just before the idiophone is pronounced. And so the gesture seems to accompany the rest of the phrase, and the idiophone then is pronounced without a gesture. And here's an example of an idiophone, in this case, the idiophone dek, that's pronounced twice, that's not used with any gesture at all. So if we look at these initial findings, which should probably be rechecked for how each of these were classed, but as an initial rough finding, we do see that ideophones are more likely to occur with gestures than the quantifiers overall. So about half of the ideophones occur with a gesture, where only a small percentage, less than 30% of the expressive quantifiers occur with a gesture. And we see that for ideophones that are pronounced with expressiveness, the likelihood that they also occur with a gesture, at least by these initial numbers, shows that it's actually a bit more frequent to have ideophones and gestures co-occurring than to have just a gesture or just expressiveness. So with ideophones, we do see that expressiveness is correlated with a higher rate of the use of gestures. This is not at all found with quantifiers. With quantifiers, it makes no difference if expressiveness is used or not. They're still just as unlikely to be pronounced with a gesture. So while we can see that for Barayin, this is probably true that ideophones are associated with both expressiveness and gestures, these quantifiers seem to only be associated with expressiveness, and there is no association between these quantifiers and gestures. And so we can see a separation conceptually being played out here, where ideophones as a class get associated with both this prosodic expressiveness as well as this physical expressiveness of manual gestures, but the quantifiers only get associated with the prosodic expressiveness and not with gestures. That's all I had to say for today. So thank you very much for listening. I'd be happy to share the references with anybody interested. I'm looking forward to your questions.